certain legislation, which this administration has opposed. I didn't say we had the worst education in the world. What I said was that 10 years ago, we were producing twice as many scientists and engineers as the Soviet Union, and today they're producing twice as many as we are, and that this affects our security around the world. And fourth, I believe that the polls and other studies and votes in the United Nations and anyone reading the paper and any citizen of the United States must come to the conclusion that the United States no longer carries the same image of a vital society on the move with its brightest days ahead as it carried a decade or 2 decades ago. Part of that is because we've stood still here at home, because we haven't met our problems in the United States, because we haven't had a moving economy. Part of that, as the Gallup polls show, is because the Soviet Union made a breakthrough in outer space. Mr. George Allen, head of your information service, has said that that made the people of the world begin to wonder whether we were first in science. We're first in other areas of science, but in space, which is the new science, we're not first.
For Senator Kennedy.
Senator, another question in connection with our relations with the Russians. There have been stories from Washington, from the Atomic Energy Commission, hinting that the Russians may have resumed the testing of nuclear devices. Now, if this is true, should the United States resume nuclear testing? And if the Russians do not start testing, can you foresee any circumstances in 1961 in which the United States might resume its own series of tests?
Yes, I think the next president of the United States should make one last effort to secure an agreement on the cessation of tests, number one. I think we should go back to Geneva, whichever elected president, Mr. Nixon or myself, and try once again. If we fail then, if we're unable to come to an agreement, and I hope we can come to an agreement, because it does not merely involve now the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union as atomic powers. Because of new breakthroughs in atomic energy technology, there's some indications that by the time the next president's term of office has come to an end, there may be 10, 15, or 20 countries with an atomic capacity. Perhaps that many testing bombs, with all the effect that it could have on the atmosphere, and with all the chances that more and more countries will have an atomic capacity, with more and more chance of war. So one more effort should be made. I don't think that even if that effort fails, that it will be necessary to carry on tests in the atmosphere which pollute the atmosphere. They can be carried out underground, they can be carried on in outer space. But I believe the effort should be made once more by who's ever elected president of the United States. If we fail, it's been a great, serious failure for everyone, for the human race. I hope we can succeed. Then if we fail, responsibility will be clearly on the Russians, and then we'll have to meet our responsibilities to the security of the United States. And there may have to be testing underground. I think the Atomic Energy Committee is prepared for it. There may be testing in outer space. I hope it will not be necessary for any power to resume it. Testing in the atmosphere. It's possible to detect those kind of tests. The kind of tests which you can't detect in underground or perhaps in outer space. So that I'm hopeful we can try once more. If we fail, then we must meet our responsibilities to ourselves. But I'm most concerned about the whole problem of the spread of atomic weapons. China may have it by 1963. Egypt. War has been the constant companion of mankind. So to have these weapons disseminated around the world, I believe, means that we're going to move through a period of hazard in the next few years. We ought to make one last effort.
Any comment, Mr. Vice President?
Yes. I would say, first of all, that we must have in mind the fact that we have been negotiating to get tests inspected and to get an agreement for many, many months. As a matter of fact, there's been a moratorium on testing as a result of the fact that we have been negotiating. I've reached the conclusion that the Soviet Union is actually filibustering. I've reached the conclusion, too, based on the reports that have been made, that they may be cheating. I don't think we can wait until the next president is inaugurated and then selects a new team and then all the months of negotiating that will take place before we reach a decision. I think that immediately after this election, we should set a timetable, the next president, working with the President Eisenhower, a timetable to break the Soviet filibuster. There should be no tests in the atmosphere. That rules out any fallout. But as far as underground tests are concerned, and particularly underground tests for developing peaceful uses of atomic energy, we should not allow this Soviet filibuster to continue. I think it's time for them to fish or cut bait. I think that the next president, immediately after his election, should sit down with the president, work out a timetable, and get a decision on this before January of next year.
Our second round of questions begins with one from Mr. Edwards for the Vice President.
Mr. Nixon, carrying forward this business about a timetable, as you know, The pressures are increasing for a summit conference. Both you and Senator Kennedy have said that there are certain conditions which must be met before you would meet with Khrushchev. Will you be more specific about these conditions?
Well, the conditions I laid out in one of our previous television debates, and it's rather difficult to be much more specific than that. First of all, we have to have adequate preparation for a summit conference. This means at the Secretary of State level and at the ambassadorial level. By adequate preparation, I mean that at that level we must prepare an agenda agreed upon with the approval of the heads of state involved. Now, this agenda should delineate those issues on which there is a possibility of some agreement or negotiation. I don't believe we should go to a summit conference unless we have such an agenda, unless we have some reasonable assurance from Mr. Khrushchev that he intends seriously to negotiate on those points. Now, this may seem like a rigid and flexible position, but let's look at the other side of the coin. If we build up the hopes of the world by having a summit conference that is not adequately prepared, and then if Mr. Khrushchev finds some excuse for breaking it up, as he did this one, because he isn't going to get his way, we set back the cause of peace. We do not help. We can, in other words, negotiate many of these items of difference between us without going to the summit. I think we have to make a greater effort than we have been making at the Secretary of State level, at the ambassadorial level, to work out the differences that we have. And so, as far as a summit conference is concerned, it should only be entered upon, it should only be agreed upon, if the negotiations have reached the point that we have some reasonable assurance that something is going to come out of it other than some phony spirit, a spirit of Geneva or Camp David or whatever it is. When I say phony spirit, I mean phony not because the spirit is not good on our side, but because the Soviet Union simply doesn't intend to carry out what they say. Now, these are the conditions that I can lay out. I cannot be more precise than that, because until we see what Mr. Khrushchev does and what he says, we cannot indicate what our plans will be.
Any comments, Senator Kennedy?
Well, I think the President of the United States last winter indicated that before he'd go to the summit in May, and he did last fall, he indicated that there should be some agenda, that there should be some prior agreement. He hoped that there would be an agreement in part in disarmament. He also expressed the hope that there should be some understanding of the general situation in Berlin. The Soviet Union refused to agree to that, and we went to the summit, and it was disastrous. I believe we should not go to the summit until there is some reason to believe that a meeting of minds can be obtained on either Berlin, outer space, or general disarmament, including nuclear testing. In addition, I believe the next president in January and February should go to work in building the strength of the United States. The Soviet Union does understand strength. We armed a parley, Winston Churchill said 10 years ago. If we are strong, particularly as we face a crisis over Berlin, which we may in the spring or in the winter, it's important that we maintain our determination here, that we indicate that we're building our strength, that we are determined to protect our position, that we're determined to protect our commitment. And then I believe we should indicate our desire to live at peace with the world. But until we're strong here, until we're moving here, I believe a summit could not be successful. I hope that before we do meet, there will be preliminary agreements on those 4 questions, or at least 2 of them, or even one of them, which would warrant such a meeting. I think if we had stuck by that position last winter, we would have been in a better position in May.
We have time for only 1 or 2 more questions before the closing statements. Now, Walter Cronkite's question for Senator Kennedy.
Senator, the charge has been made frequently that the United States for many years has been on the defensive around the world. Our policy has been one of reaction to the Soviet Union rather than positive action on our own. What areas do you see where the United States might take the offensive in a challenge to communism over the next 4 to 8 years?
One of the areas, and of course the most vulnerable area, is I have felt has been Eastern Europe. I've been critical of the administration's failure to suggest policies which would make it possible for us to establish, for example, closer relations with Poland, particularly after the 55-56 period and the Hungarian Revolution. We indicated at that time that we were not going to intervene militarily. But there was a period there when Poland demonstrated a national independence, and even the Polish government moved some different distance away from the Soviet Union. I suggested that we amend our legislation so that we could enjoy closer economic ties. We received the support first of the administration and then not. We were defeated by one vote in the Senate. We passed the bill in the Senate this year, but it didn't pass the House. I would say Eastern Europe is the area of vulnerability of the Soviet Union. Secondly, the relations between Russia and China. They are now engaged in a debate over whether war is the means of communizing the world, or whether they should use subversion, infiltration, economic struggles, and all the rest. No one can say what that course of action will be, but I think the next president of the United States should watch it carefully. If those two powers should split, it could have great effects throughout the entire world. Thirdly, I believe that India represents a great area for affirmative action by the free world. India started from about the same place that China did. Chinese communists have been moving ahead the last 10 years. India, under a free society, has been making some progress. But if India does not succeed, with their 450 million people, if she can't make freedom work, then people around the world are going to determine, particularly in the underdeveloped world, that the only way that they can develop their resources is through the communist system. Fourth, let me say that in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, the great force on our side is the desire of people to be free. This has expressed itself in the revolts in Eastern Europe. It's expressed itself in the desire of the people of Africa to be independent of Western Europe. They want to be free. And my judgment is that they don't want to give their freedom up to become communists. They want to stay free, independent perhaps of us, but certainly independent of the communists. And I believe if we identify ourselves with that force, if we identify ourselves with it as Lincoln, as Wilson did, as Franklin Roosevelt did, if we become known as the friend of freedom, sustaining freedom, helping these people in the fight against poverty and ignorance and disease, helping them build their lives, I believe in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, eventually in the Eastern Europe and the Middle East, certainly in Western Europe, we can strengthen freedom. We can make it move. We can put the communists on the defensive.
Your comment, Mr. Vice President?
First, with regard to Poland, when I talked to Mr. Gomulka, the present leader of Poland, for 6 hours in Warsaw last year, I learned something about their problems, and particularly his. Right under the Soviet gun, with Soviet troops there, he is in a very difficult position in taking anything independent, a position which would be independent of the Soviet Union. And yet, let's just see what we've done for Poland. $500 million worth of aid has gone to Poland, primarily economic, primarily to go to the people of Poland. This should continue, and it can be stepped up, to give them hope, and to keep alive the hope for freedom that I can testify they have so deeply within them. In addition, we can have more exchange with Poland, or with any other of the Iron Curtain countries, which show some desire to take a different path than the path that has been taken by the ones that are complete satellites of the Soviet Union. Now, as far as the balance of the world is concerned, I, of course, don't have as much time as Senator Kennedy has. I would just like to add this one point. If we are going to have the initiative in the world, we must remember that the people of Africa and Asia and Latin America don't want to be pawns simply in a struggle between two great powers, the Soviet Union and the United States. We have to let them know that we want to help them, not because we're simply trying to save our own skins, not because we're simply trying to fight communism, but because we care for them, because we stand for freedom, because if there were no communism in the world, we would still fight poverty and misery and disease and tyranny. If we can get that across to the people of these countries in this decade of the 60s, the struggle for freedom will be won.
John Chancellor's question for Vice President Nixon.
Sir, I'd like to ask you another question about Quemoy and Matsu. Both you and Senator Kennedy say you agree with the President on this subject and with our treaty obligations. But the subject remains in the campaign as an issue. Now, sir, is this because each of you feels obliged to respond to the other when he talks about Quemoy and Matsu? And if that's true, do you think an end should be called to this discussion, or will it stay with us as a campaign issue?
I would say that the issue will stay with us as a campaign issue just as long as Senator Kennedy persists in what I think is a fundamental error. He says he supports the President's position. He says that he voted for the resolution. Well, just let me point this out. He voted for the resolution in 1955, which gave the President the power to use the forces of the United States to defend Formosa and the offshore islands. But he also voted then for an amendment, which was lost, fortunately, an amendment which would have drawn a line and left out those islands and denied the right to the president to defend those islands if he thought that it was an attack on Formosa.